The wolves found her scent first. Mara Jennings pressed her back against the skeletal remains of a lightning-struck pine, her breath coming in short, desperate puffs that crystallized instantly in the bitter Nevada air. The pack's howls echoed through the canyon behind her, growing closer with each passing moment. Her fingers, numb with cold, clutched the fraying cloth sack that contained everything she owned in this world. 3 silver coins, a faded bonnet, and a letter that had led her to this God-forsaken wilderness. December 15th, 1880. She should have been married by now, settled in a warm house with a man who'd promised her safety and love through carefully penned letters. Instead, she was running for her life, through a blizzard that showed no mercy to the foolish or desperate. The first wolf emerged from the swirling snow, like a gray ghost, its yellow eyes fixed on her with predatory intelligence. Then another, and another. 5 in total, their lean bodies built for survival in this harsh landscape that had already claimed so many dreams. Mara had never killed anything larger than a chicken, but desperation bred courage in the strangest ways. She grabbed a fallen branch, thick as her forearm, and solid enough to do damage. The lead wolf, a massive male with scars across his muzzle, padded closer. His lips pulled back to reveal teeth that could crush bone. "Stay back," she whispered, though her voice was lost in the wind. "Please just stay back." The wolf tensed, preparing to spring, when a sharp crack split the air. The report of a rifle echoed off the canyon walls, and the lead wolf yelped, stumbling sideways as blood bloomed across his shoulder. The pack scattered instantly, vanishing into the storm as quickly as they'd appeared. Mara spun toward the sound, her heart hammering against her ribs. Through the curtain of snow, a dark figure emerged on horseback, a Winchester rifle still smoking in his hands. The man was tall and broad-shouldered beneath his heavy coat, his face hidden beneath the brim of a weathered hat. "You hurt." His voice was rough-clipped, carrying easily through the wind. She shook her head, not trusting her voice. Her legs felt like water. "And what in hell are you doing out here?" He guided his horse closer, and she could see his face now, angular features carved by weather and hardship, eyes the color of winter sky. He was perhaps 35, with the kind of face that had seen too much and trusted too little. I was looking for the town, Creswell." The words tumbled out between chattering teeth. "I got lost." He studied her for a long moment, taking in her city dress, her impractical shoes, the way she clutched that pathetic bag like it held the crown jewels. "Town's 3 miles that way," he said, nodding toward what looked like empty wilderness. "But you'll freeze to death before you make it halfway. Storm's getting worse." As if to prove his point, the wind howled louder, driving snow so thick it was like being trapped inside a milk bottle. Mara could barely see 5 feet in any direction. "There's a station master in Creswell," she said, though, even as the words left her mouth, she knew how foolish they sounded. "He'll let me wait for the morning train." The man's laugh was bitter. "Sam Mackenzie. He's drunk by sundown every night, and he's got no love for strays. You'll end up in a snowbank by dawn." He was quiet for a moment, wrestling with something. "There's a line shack about a mile from here. It's not much, but it's got 4 walls and a roof." Hope flared in her chest. "Thank you. I can pay. Keep your money." He dismounted and began untying a bedroll from behind his saddle. "What's your name?" Mara Jennings." He paused in his work, something flickering across his features. "You one of those mail-order brides?" Heat flooded her cheeks despite the cold. "I was supposed to be. The humiliation of it all came rushing back. "The man who wrote to me, Alan R. Silverbend. He was supposed to meet me at the station this afternoon. He never came." This time the man went completely still. When he looked at her, his eyes had gone hard as flint. "Silverbend, you said?" "Yes. Do you know him?" A muscle ticked in his jaw. "I know him." He handed her the bedroll, his movements sharp with suppressed anger. "We need to move. That shack's our only chance." The line shack turned out to be a weathered cabin built into the side of a hill, its logs chinked with mud and moss. Inside it was barely warmer than outside, but it blocked the wind. The man who still hadn't told her his name got a fire going in the stone hearth, while Mara huddled in the corner, wrapped in his bedroll. "So tell me about these letters," he said once the flames were crackling. "What did Silverbend promise you?" Something in his tone made her wary. A home, a family. He said he had a ranch outside Creswell that he needed a wife to help run it. She pulled the crumpled letter from her bag. He seemed kind in his writing, gentle. The man took the letter, scanning it quickly. His face grew darker with each line. "Son of a bitch," he muttered. "What is it?" He handed the letter back. "That ranch he mentioned, it belongs to me. Alan Reed." He saw her confusion and continued. "Silverbend's my neighbor, if you can call him that. Lives about 10 miles east in a shanty that's barely standing. And he's no gentleman, Miss Jennings. He's a drunken gambler and worse." The words hit her like physical blows. But the letters. He wrote about love, about building a life together. He wrote about my land, my cattle, my life. Alan's voice was cold with fury. "Bastard's been watching my place for months, learning details. He knew you'd never come for him, so he pretended to be me." Mara felt the last of her hopes crumble. Then there never was a Alan R. Silverbend who wanted to marry me. No. Alan poked at the fire with unnecessary violence. There wasn't. They sat in silence for a while, the only sound the pop of burning wood and the endless moan of wind through the chinks in the walls. Finally Mara spoke. "Why did you help me?" Alan was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he did, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Because I know what it's like to be alone." The storm raged through the night, but the little cabin held. When dawn finally broke, the world was transformed into a crystalline wilderness of white. Alan saddled his horse while Mara gathered her few belongings. "I'll take you to town," he said. "You can catch the eastbound train tomorrow." "Where will I go?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. He paused in checking his rifle. "Where did you come from?" "Kentucky. But there's nothing for me there anymore." She thought of the debts her father had left behind the creditors, who'd made it clear that marriage was her only escape from the poorhouse. "I sold everything I owned to come here. This was supposed to be my new start." Alan mounted his horse and reached down to help her up behind him. New starts are harder to come by than most people think. The ride to Creswell took 2 hours through snow that came up to the horse's belly. The town, when they finally reached it, was exactly what Mara had feared, a collection of ramshackle buildings huddled against the elements, like animals seeking shelter. The train station was a squat wooden structure with windows so grimy they might as well have been painted black. Alan tied his horse to the hitching post outside. Station master's probably sleeping it off, but there should be someone around. He hesitated, then pulled a small leather pouch from his coat. "Take this. I can't. It's not charity. It's justice." He pressed the pouch into her hands. "Silverbend owes you more than this for what he put you through." Inside the station, they found Sam Mackenzie, exactly as Alan had predicted, passed out on a bench behind the ticket counter, reeking of whiskey and tobacco. A schedule board showed the next eastbound train wouldn't arrive until the following afternoon. "There's a boarding house across the street," Alan said. "Mrs. Patterson runs it. She's decent enough." Mara nodded, though the thought of another night in this desolate place made her stomach clench with anxiety. "What about Silverbend? Won't he try this again with some other poor girl?" Alan's face went granite hard. "He won't be bothering anyone else." There was something in his tone that made her shiver. "What are you going to do? What should have been done months ago?" He touched the brim of his hat. "Safe travels, Miss Jennings. I hope you find what you're looking for." He was almost to the door when she called after him. Mr. Reed, he turned. Thank you for everything. He nodded once and was gone, leaving her alone with the drunk station master and the sound of wind rattling the windows. The boarding house was marginally better than the station clean, at least though the thin walls did little to block the cold. Mrs. Patterson, a bird-like woman with sharp eyes and sharper opinions, clucked disapprovingly at Mara's story. Mail-order brides. She sniffed as she led Mara to a tiny room under the eaves. Nothing but trouble, the lot of them. Mark my words, dear, you're better off going back where you came from. Mara said nothing. What was there to say that she had no home to return to? That this frozen wasteland represented the last of her options. She paid for the room with some of Alan's money and spent the rest of the day staring out her window at the empty street below. As evening fell, she heard shouting from somewhere across town. Then a gunshot. Then another. She pressed her face to the glass, trying to see what was happening. But the darkness revealed nothing. It wasn't until the next morning that she learned the truth. Found Silverbend dead in his shack. Mrs. Patterson announced over breakfast, her voice thrumming with excitement. Shot twice in the chest. Sheriff says it looks like self-defense. Apparently the fool drew on Alan Reed. Mara's coffee cup rattled against the saucer as she set it down. Self-defense? Oh, yes. Reed came to have words with him about some missing cattle, and Silverbend went for his gun. Poor aim, though. Reed put 2 bullets in him before he could fire a shot. Mrs. Patterson leaned closer, dropping her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. Between you and me, dear, the world's better off without that piece of trash. He's been preying on decent folk for years. The train couldn't come soon enough. Mara spent the morning pacing her room, unable to shake the feeling that she was somehow responsible for Silverbend's death. If she hadn't come to Nevada, if she hadn't told Alan about the letters, when the whistle finally sounded at 2 o'clock, she was waiting on the platform with her bag clutched in her hands. The eastbound train was a battered old thing that had seen better decades, its cars scarred by sand and weather. As she climbed aboard, she caught sight of a familiar figure standing in the shadow of the station, Alan Reed watching her go. Their eyes met for a moment across the platform. He touched his hat brim in farewell, and she raised her hand in response. Then the train lurched into motion, and he was gone. The conductor, a portly man with tobacco-stained teeth, punched her ticket and moved on. Mara settled into her seat and watched the Nevada landscape roll past the window, endless expanses of sagebrush and stone mountains that looked like broken teeth against the sky. It was beautiful in its way, but forbidding. Unforgiving. She was nearly asleep when the train began to slow. They were still miles from anywhere surrounded by empty desert. Mara sat up alarmed as the brakes squealed and the cars shuddered to a halt. "What's happening?" she asked the woman across the aisle. Before the woman could answer, the door at the front of the car burst open. A man stumbled in, hat pulled low, a bandana covering the lower half of his face. In his hand was a pistol, its barrel gleaming dully in the afternoon light. "Nobody move," he shouted. "This here's a robbery." Panic rippled through the car. Several women screamed. The man across from Mara fumbled for his wallet with shaking hands. Mara herself pressed back against her seat, heart hammering. The robber worked his way down the aisle, collecting jewelry money and anything else of value. He was young, she realized, probably no more than 25, with wild eyes that spoke of desperation rather than experience. When he reached her seat, he held out a canvas bag. "Everything you got, lady, and make it quick." With trembling fingers, Mara emptied her reticule into the bag. The last of Alan's money, her mother's silver locket, even the few coins she'd been saving at all, went into the robber's sack. But as she reached for the cloth bag at her feet, her fingers brushed against something she'd forgotten. The letter. Silverbend's letter. An idea born of desperation and fury crystallized in her mind. As the robber turned to move on to the next passenger, she spoke. "You're making a mistake." He spun back toward her, gun raised. "What did you say?" "I said you're making a mistake." Her voice was steadier now, though her pulse was racing. "This train's carrying a federal payroll, government money. You rob it, and you'll have every marshal west of the Mississippi hunting you." The robber's eyes widened slightly. "You're lying." "Am I?" Mara pulled out the letter, its official-looking seal still partially intact. "I'm a federal inspector. This is my authorization." She held it up just long enough for him to see the formal script, then tucked it away. "That payroll's locked in the express car, but it's worth more than everything you'll collect from these passengers combined." For a moment, the robber wavered. Mara could see him weighing the risk against the potential reward. Finally, greed won out. "Where's the express car?" "2 cars back, but you'll need dynamite to get into the safe." The robber grinned beneath his bandana. "Lady, I come prepared." He backed toward the door, keeping his gun trained on the passengers. "If anyone moves before I'm gone, I'll put a bullet in them." As soon as he disappeared through the rear door, Mara was on her feet. She rushed to the front of the car where the conductor was cowering behind a seat. "Do you have a gun?" she demanded. He shook his head, trembling. "Against railroad policy." "Then we need to get to the engine. That fool's about to blow up the express car, and we need to be moving when he does." It took precious minutes to work their way forward through the panicked passengers. By the time they reached the locomotive, Mara could hear the robber shouting at the express car guards. She grabbed the engineer by the shoulder. "Can you get us moving right now?" "Lady, there's a man with a gun back there. There's going to be an explosion back there. And when it happens, we need to be gone, or we'll all be killed in the wreck." The engineer's face went pale. He looked out at the empty desert, then back at Mara's determined expression. "Hold on," he said and pulled the whistle. The train lurched forward just as the explosion rocked the desert. The blast was tremendous, sending a pillar of smoke and flame into the sky. The force of it shattered windows throughout the train and knocked Mara to her knees. But they were moving, gaining speed with each passing second. Behind them, she could see a figure stumbling through the smoke, the robber thrown clear of the blast, but very much alive. And very angry. The train picked up speed, racing across the Nevada landscape like a thing possessed. It wasn't until they were miles away from the explosion site that the engineer finally began to slow down. By then, it was nearly dark. "So next stop's Cedar Junction." He called back to Mara. "We'll wire ahead, let the authorities know what happened." Mara nodded, though she was already having second thoughts about her impulsive heroics. The robber had seen her face, knew she was the one who tricked him. Men like that had long memories and longer reach. Cedar Junction turned out to be even smaller than Creswell, little more than a water stop with a handful of buildings clustered around the tracks. But it had a telegraph office, and within an hour, word of the attempted robbery was flying across the territory. The local sheriff, a grizzled man named Patterson, who claimed to be Mrs. Patterson's cousin, took Mara's statement with professional interest. "You did good, miss," he said when she'd finished. That was quick thinking with the fake federal inspector story. Probably saved a dozen lives. "Will you catch him?" Patterson shrugged. "Maybe. Desert's a big place and he's got a head start. But he's on foot now and winter's coming on hard. Might be the cold gets him before we do." Mara spent the night in Cedar Junction's only boarding house, another cramped, cheerless place that reminded her of all the reasons she'd wanted to leave Kentucky in the first place. The next morning brought news that made her blood run cold. "Found the robber's body about 5 miles north of the blast site," Sheriff Patterson announced over breakfast. "Froze to death during the night. But here's the interesting part, he had a letter on him. Letter addressed to you, Miss Jennings." Mara's hands shook as she took the envelope. Her name was scrawled across the front in crude handwriting, and inside was a single sheet of paper. "You cost me everything, bitch, but I got friends. This ain't over." The sheriff read the note over her shoulder and whistled low. "Looks like you made yourself an enemy. Dead enemy, but still, if he's got friends like he says." "What should I do?" Get as far from here as you can, and do it fast." Patterson's expression was grim. Men like that, they don't work alone, and they don't forgive. Within an hour, Mara was back on an eastbound train this time, with a final destination of Denver. It was the farthest her remaining money would take her, and at that point distance seemed more important than direction. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. The train broke down outside a tiny settlement called Pine Ridge, its engine coughing black smoke before shuddering to a final permanent stop. The engineer announced it would be at least 3 days before replacement parts could be shipped in from Carson City. Pine Ridge made Cedar Junction look like a metropolis. It consisted of a general store, a blacksmith shop, and a saloon that had definitely seen better decades. The only accommodation was a boarding house run by a woman who introduced herself simply as Kate, and who clearly had experience with stranded travelers. $1-a-night meals included, she said, sizing Mara up with shrewd eyes. Payment in advance. Mara counted her remaining money. She had enough for 3 nights, but that would leave her completely broke when the train was repaired. She was pondering this grim mathematics when a familiar voice spoke behind her. "I'll cover her bill." She spun around to find Alan Reed standing in the doorway, hat in hand, looking as surprised to see her as she was to see him. "Mr. Reed, what are you doing here?" Could ask you the same question. He nodded to Kate. "Put Miss Jennings in your best room. I'll settle the account." Kate looked between them with interest, but said nothing. She handed Mara a key and pointed toward the stairs. "Second door on the left. Supper's at 6. Mara wanted to protest to maintain what little dignity she had left, but practicality won out. She took the key and headed upstairs, acutely aware of Alan's eyes following her. Her room was small, but clean, with a narrow bed and a washstand that had seen considerable use. She set her bag on the dresser and sat heavily on the bed, suddenly exhausted by the events of the past few days. The train robbery, the threatening letter, the endless succession of cheerless towns. It all felt like a nightmare from which she couldn't wake. A knock at the door interrupted her brooding. She opened it to find Alan standing in the hallway, his expression unreadable. "May I come in?" She stepped aside and he entered, closing the door behind him. For a moment they stood in awkward silence. Finally he spoke. "The sheriff in Cedar Junction sent word about what happened on the train, about the robbery. Then you know I'm in trouble. More than you realize." His face was grim. "The man you helped kill, Bobby Hendricks, he rode with the Chambers gang. Ever heard of them?" Mara shook her head. "They're bad men, Miss Jennings. The kind who burn down churches just to watch them burn. And they don't take kindly to folks who cross them." The words hit her like ice water. "How long do I have? They probably don't even know about you yet. News travels slow out here. But when they find out..." He shrugged. "Could be weeks. Could be days." Mara sank onto the bed, overwhelmed. "I can't run forever. I don't have the money and I don't have anywhere to go." Alan was quiet for a long moment, staring out the small window at the desert beyond. When he finally spoke, his voice was careful, measured. "There is another option." "What?" He turned to face her, and she saw something in his eyes she hadn't noticed before. A deep, abiding loneliness that matched her own. "You could come with me to my ranch." The suggestion caught her completely off guard. "Mr. Reed, I couldn't possibly..." "Hear me out." He held up a hand. "It's not what you think. I'm not proposing marriage or anything like that. I'm talking about employment. I need help around the place, someone to cook and clean and..." He hesitated. "And help with my daughter." This was the first time he'd mentioned having a child. "Your daughter..." "Becca. She's 3 years old." His voice softened slightly. "Her mother died giving birth to her. Since then, it's just been the 2 of us, and I'm not much good at the domestic side of things." Mara studied his face, looking for signs of deception or hidden motives. She found none, only a man who was as alone as she was trying to make the best of a bad situation. "The Chambers gang," she said. "Wouldn't I be putting you in danger? They wouldn't look for you at a working ranch. And if they did," he touched the gun at his hip, "I can take care of myself. And you." It wasn't much of a choice, but it was better than any alternative she could see. "What would you expect from me?" "Cooking, cleaning, laundry. Basic household management. In exchange, you'd have room and board and a small salary. Nothing fancy, but enough to get by." "And your daughter? What's she like?" For the first time since she'd known him, Alan's expression grew truly soft. "She's special. Different. She hasn't spoken since her mother died. The doctor says there's nothing wrong with her physically, but..." He shrugged helplessly. "She just doesn't talk to anyone." Mara felt her heart contract with sympathy. A motherless child, silent with grief, it was almost too tragic to contemplate. "I don't have much experience with children." "Neither do I," Alan admitted. "We'd both be learning." Outside, the wind was picking up, rattling the windows and moaning through the gaps in the walls. Night was falling, and with it came the cold. Mara thought about the long, uncertain journey ahead of her, the faceless enemies who might be hunting her, the dwindling resources that represented her only shield against destitution. "All right," she said quietly. "I'll come with you." Relief flooded Alan's features. "Thank you. We'll leave first thing in the morning." After he'd gone, Mara sat alone in her room, watching the shadows lengthen across the walls. She'd come to Nevada seeking a new life, and in a roundabout way, she was getting one. Not the life she'd imagined, not marriage to a kind rancher who would love and cherish her, but perhaps something better. A chance to be useful, to matter to someone, to build something meaningful from the wreckage of her dreams. She thought about the silent little girl waiting at Alan's ranch, a child who had lost her mother, before she was old enough to understand what that meant. Perhaps they could help each other heal. Perhaps in caring for someone else's wounds, Mara could begin to tend to her own. The next morning dawned clear and cold, with a bite in the air that promised winter's full arrival. Alan appeared at the boarding house before sunrise, leading a horse loaded with supplies. He'd also brought a second mount, a gentle-looking mare with kind eyes and a patient disposition. "Her name's Daisy," he said, helping Mara into the saddle. "She's old, but she's steady. Won't give you any trouble." The ride to Alan's ranch took most of the day through country that grew progressively more isolated with each passing mile. They followed deer trails and wagon tracks that barely qualified as roads, winding through stands of pine and aspen that glowed golden in the afternoon light. It was beautiful country, but lonely, the kind of place where you could go weeks without seeing another soul. "How far are we from town?" Mara asked during one of their rest stops. "Creswell's about 15 miles southeast. There's a closer settlement called Willow Creek, but it's not much, just a trading post and a few cabins." "Don't you get lonely?" Alan was quiet for a moment, watering the horses at a small stream. "Loneliness is a choice," he said finally. "At least, that's what I tell myself." They reached the ranch just as the sun was setting behind the western mountains. It was a modest spread, a 2-story log house, a barn, a few outbuildings, and corrals that held maybe 50 head of cattle. Smoke rose from the chimney, and warm light glowed in the windows, making the whole scene look like something from a storybook. "Home," Alan said simply. As they dismounted, the front door opened, and a small figure appeared in the doorway. Becca Reed was tiny for her age, with a heart-shaped face and enormous dark eyes that seemed to take in everything without judgment. Her brown hair was braided, becoming loose, and she wore a simple blue dress that had clearly been mended several times. She stood perfectly still as her father approached, her gaze shifting between him and the stranger he'd brought home. When Alan knelt down to her level, She didn't run to him or speak. She simply waited, watching. "Becca, this is Miss Jennings," Alan said gently. "She's going to be staying with us for a while, helping around the house." Becca's eyes moved to Mara, studying her with unsettling intensity. There was something almost otherworldly about the child's silence, as if she were listening to conversations the rest of the world couldn't hear. Mara knelt down as well, bringing herself to Becca's eye level. "Hello, sweetheart," she said softly. "It's very nice to meet you." Becca tilted her head slightly, still silent, still watching. Then, without warning, she stepped forward and placed her small hand in Mara's. The gesture was so unexpected, so trusting, that Mara felt tears prick her eyes. "She likes you," Alan said, and there was wonder in his voice. She's not usually comfortable with strangers." Mara squeezed the little hand gently. "Maybe we understand each other." Inside the house was spartanly furnished, but comfortable. The main room contained a stone fireplace, a few mismatched chairs, and a dining table that looked homemade. The kitchen was functional, but basic, clearly the domain of someone who viewed cooking as a necessary evil rather than an art. "Your room's upstairs," Alan said, lighting a lamp. "It's not much, but it's private." He led her up a narrow staircase to a small bedroom under the eaves. It contained a single bed, a dresser, and a washstand, simple furnishings, but clean and well-maintained. A window looked out over the ranch yard where the barn and corrals were silhouetted against the star-filled sky. "This is perfect," Mara said, and meant it. After weeks of cramped train cars and cheerless boarding houses, the little room felt like a palace. "Becca's room is across the hall," Alan said. "Mine's downstairs, if you need anything." "I'll be fine, thank you." He hesitated in the doorway, as if there were something more he wanted to say. Finally he spoke. "I know this isn't what you came west for, but I hope you can be happy here." After he'd gone, Mara unpacked her few belongings and prepared for bed. Through the thin walls, she could hear Alan moving around downstairs, banking the fire and securing the house for the night. It was a comforting sound, the sound of a man taking care of his responsibilities, protecting what mattered to him. She thought about Becca, the child who had taken her hand with such simple trust. What had it cost the little girl to lose her mother so young? What kind of strength did it take for a 3-year-old to carry such grief in silence? As she drifted off to sleep, Mara found herself thinking about the life she might build here. Not the life she'd dreamed of, perhaps, but maybe something better. Something real earned through work and care, and the gradual building of trust. She woke before dawn to the sound of Alan moving around in the kitchen below. By the time she dressed and came downstairs, he had coffee brewing and was attempting to fry eggs with the grim determination of a man performing an unpleasant duty. "Let me," Mara said gently, taking the spatula from his hands. He stepped back gratefully. "I can manage the basics, but cooking isn't your strong suit." She finished with a smile. "That's all right. It's mine." She salvaged the eggs and started fresh with new ones, adding herbs she found growing in pots on the windowsill. Within minutes, the kitchen filled with the aroma of a proper breakfast, something more appetizing than the utilitarian meals Alan had clearly been subjecting himself and his daughter to. Becca appeared as Mara was setting the table, drawn by the smell of real cooking. She climbed into her chair without a word, but her eyes were bright with interest as Mara placed a plate in front of her. "I hope you like it," Mara said. "I wasn't sure what you preferred." Becca took a small bite, chewed thoughtfully, then looked up at Mara with something that might have been approval. It wasn't much, but it felt like a victory. Over the following days, Mara settled into the rhythm of ranch life. She rose early to prepare breakfast, spent her mornings cleaning and organizing the house, and devoted her afternoons to the endless cycle of laundry mending and meal preparation. It was hard work, but satisfying in a way her previous life had never been. Alan treated her with unfailing courtesy, but there was a careful distance in his manner that spoke of a man who had learned not to let people get too close. He worked from dawn to dusk, repairing fences, tending cattle, and maintaining the 100 small things that kept a ranch running. In the evenings, he would sit by the fire with a book or tend to paperwork, speaking little, but creating a sense of quiet companionship that Mara found oddly comforting. It was Becca, however, who claimed most of Mara's attention. The child was like a puzzle waiting to be solved, intelligent, observant, but locked away behind walls of silence that seemed impenetrable. She would follow Mara around the house, watching her work with intense concentration, occasionally offering wordless assistance by fetching things or pointing out problems. She's never done that before. Alan observed one evening watching his daughter help Mara fold laundry. She usually keeps to herself. Maybe she just needed someone who had time to pay attention to her, Mara suggested. It was true that Alan, for all his obvious love for his daughter, was often too busy with ranch work to give her the focused attention a child needed. Mara made it a point to include Becca in her daily activities, narrating what she was doing and asking for the child's help, even when it would have been faster to work alone. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Becca began to emerge from her shell. She started spending more time in the kitchen, while Mara cooked, eventually climbing onto a chair to watch more closely. She began bringing Mara small gifts, pretty stones, wildflowers, drawings made with charcoal on scraps of paper. The breakthrough came on a cold November morning, 3 weeks after Mara's arrival. She was in the kitchen making bread when she heard a soft humming coming from the dining room, where Becca was playing with a set of wooden blocks Alan had carved for her. Mara froze, her hands still in the bread dough. The humming was barely audible, more vibration than sound, but it was unmistakably musical. She waited, afraid that any movement might break the spell, and gradually the humming grew stronger, more confident. It was a lullaby, simple, sweet, and heartbreakingly familiar. Mara's mother had sung the same song to her when she was small. Without thinking, she began to hum along, her voice blending with Becca's in perfect harmony. The humming stopped abruptly. Mara held her breath, wondering if she'd overstepped some invisible boundary. Then tentatively, the melody resumed, and this time Mara joined in from the beginning. They hummed together for several minutes, creating a sound that filled the little house with warmth and life. When Alan came in for lunch, he stopped dead in the doorway, his face a mask of amazement. Becca was sitting at the table, still humming softly while she played, and Mara was moving around the kitchen with a lightness in her step that spoke of genuine contentment. "She's making music," he whispered, as if speaking too loudly might shatter the moment. "She's been humming all morning." Mara replied quietly, "I think she's been wanting to for a long time. She just needed to feel safe enough to try." That afternoon, Alan found an excuse to work closer to the house, clearly reluctant to miss any further developments. His patience was rewarded when Becca, growing bolder, began to experiment with simple melodies, some remembered, others apparently original. By evening, the child's confidence had grown enough that she hummed openly during dinner, filling the spaces between conversation with gentle, wordless songs. Alan listened with an expression of wonder, as if witnessing a miracle. "I'd forgotten," he said later after Becca had gone to bed. "Before her mother died, she used to sing all the time. Sarah, my wife, she had a beautiful voice, and Becca would try to copy her. Music is one of the first things children lose when they're traumatized," Mara said, "and often one of the first things to come back when they start to heal." "How do you know that?" Mara was quiet for a moment, staring into the fire. "I was silent for almost a year after my mother died. My father, he wasn't a patient man. He thought I was being willful, stubborn. But I just couldn't find my voice." What brought it back? A neighbor woman who had the sense to realize that pushing would only make things worse. She would sit with me and read stories, never demanding that I respond, just being present. Eventually, I felt safe enough to speak again. Alan nodded slowly. "Sarah would have liked you," he said. She always said that healing couldn't be rushed, only encouraged. It was the first time he'd spoken freely about his late wife, and Mara sensed the significance of the moment. "Tell me about her." She was... Alan searched for words. "She was everything I'm not. Patient, gentle, optimistic. She saw the best in everyone, even when they couldn't see it in themselves." His voice grew soft with memory. "She wanted a house full of children. Used to talk about the conversations she'd have with Becca when she got older, the things they'd do together. She sounds wonderful." She was. And when she died... He shrugged helplessly. "I didn't know how to be both parents. I could keep Becca fed and clothed and safe, but the rest of it, the nurturing, the emotional connection, I was lost." "You're not lost," Mara said firmly. "You're learning. There's a difference." The next few weeks brought a gradual transformation to the Reed household. Becca's humming evolved into soft singing, though she still remained largely silent when it came to actual conversation. She began to interact more openly with both adults, bringing them drawings and small treasures, occasionally tugging on their sleeves to get their attention. Mara found herself settling deeper into the rhythms of ranch life. She learned to milk the cow, gather eggs, and tend the kitchen garden that Sarah had planted before her death. She organized the house with a thoroughness that Alan clearly appreciated, creating systems that made daily life run more smoothly. More importantly, she began to feel genuinely useful for the first time in her life. In Kentucky, she'd been a burden, an unmarried daughter consuming resources the family couldn't spare. Here, her contributions mattered. The house was cleaner, the meals were better, and Becca was clearly thriving under her care. Alan, too, seemed to be benefiting from her presence. The careful distance he maintained began to soften around the edges. He started sharing more details about his day, asking her opinion on ranch matters, including her in decisions that affected the household. It wasn't intimacy exactly, but it was partnership, something Mara had never experienced with any man. The first serious test of their arrangement came on a bitter December morning when one of the cattle broke through a fence and wandered into a canyon where the terrain was too rough for horses. Alan would have to track the animal on foot through country that was both dangerous and disorienting. "I could be gone 2 or 3 days, he told Mara as he packed supplies. "Depends on how far the beast wandered and how cooperative the weather is." "We'll be fine," Mara assured him, though the prospect of being alone with Becca for several days made her nervous. What if something went wrong? What if the child needed medical attention, or the house caught fire, or any of the 100 disasters that seemed to lurk at the edges of ranch life? "There's a rifle above the kitchen door," Alan continued. "Shells in the drawer below. You know how to shoot." "My father taught me the basics." It was one of the few useful things her father had done, though his lessons had been motivated more by practicality than affection. "Good. Probably won't need it, but..." he shrugged. "Better safe than sorry." After he'd gone, Mara and Becca settled into a routine that felt both natural and precious. Without Alan's presence to anchor them to adult concerns, they had more freedom to simply enjoy each other's company. Becca showed Mara her favorite hiding places around the ranch, shared her collection of interesting rocks, and even began making tentative attempts at actual conversation. "Pretty," she said on the second day, pointing to a frozen spider web that sparkled with frost in the morning sunlight. It was the first clear word Mara had heard her speak, and the sound of it was like music. "Yes, it is pretty," she agreed, kneeling down to examine the web more closely. "Like jewelry made of ice?" Becca nodded solemnly, clearly pleased that her observation had been received with appropriate seriousness. That evening, as they sat by the fire after dinner, Becca climbed into Mara's lap and nestled against her with the unconscious trust of a much-loved child. Mara felt something shift inside her chest, a fierce protective tenderness that was unlike anything she'd ever experienced. "I love you, little one," she whispered into the child's soft hair. Becca tilted her head back to look at her dark eyes, serious and searching. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "Love Mara too." Tears sprang to Mara's eyes. She hugged the child closer, overwhelmed by the simple perfection of the moment. Whatever else happened, whatever complications lay ahead, this was real and right and good. Alan returned the next evening, tired and cold, but successful in his mission. He found them in the kitchen where Mara was teaching Becca to knead bread dough while humming a cheerful tune. "Papa," Becca cried, running to greet him with more animation than she'd shown since his departure. Alan scooped her up, his face lighting with joy at her enthusiastic welcome. Over her head, his eyes met Mara's, and she saw gratitude there, not just for taking care of his daughter, but for helping her find her voice again. "How was your adventure?" Mara asked as she served him a hot meal. "Cold mostly, and frustrating. That cow led me halfway to Utah before I caught up with her." He took a bite of stew and closed his eyes with appreciation. "God, I missed your cooking." It was a casual comment, but it sent a warm glow through Mara's chest. She was beginning to understand that Alan's appreciation was not lightly given. It meant more because it was earned. As winter deepened, the little family fell into routines that felt increasingly natural. Alan would rise before dawn to tend the animals and handle the urgent outdoor work, then spend time with Becca while Mara prepared breakfast. Afternoons were for indoor projects, equipment repair, bookkeeping, and the endless small tasks that winter made possible. Evenings belonged to all three of them. Alan would read aloud from books ordered from distant cities, his deep voice giving life to stories of adventure and romance. Becca would play quietly with her toys, occasionally offering commentary or asking questions that showed she was following the narrative closely. Mara would work on mending or embroidery, her fingers busy while her mind absorbed the comfortable domesticity of the scene. It was during one of these evening sessions that Becca first called Alan Papa in Mara's hearing. The word slipped out naturally as she asked him to explain a picture in one of the books, but the effect on Alan was profound. His voice caught, and Mara saw him blink rapidly, fighting back tears of joy. Later, after Becca had been tucked into bed, he sat staring into the fire with an expression of wonder. "She's coming back," he said quietly. "My little girl is coming back." "She never went anywhere," Mara replied. "She was just waiting for it to be safe to be herself again." Christmas approached with little fanfare but much preparation. Mara had been saving small amounts from her salary to buy gifts, and she spent her evenings secretly crafting presents when Alan and Becca weren't looking. For Becca, she made a rag doll with carefully embroidered features and a dress that matched one of her own. For Alan, she knitted a muffler from wool she'd unraveled from an old sweater, dyeing it dark blue to match his eyes. Alan, meanwhile, had been working on projects of his own in the barn. Mara caught glimpses of wood shavings and the sound of careful carving, but he was secretive about his activities. On Christmas morning, they exchanged gifts around the kitchen table after a breakfast of pancakes and preserved fruit. Becca's delight with her doll was worth all the hours Mara had spent stitching by candlelight. The child clutched the toy to her chest and whispered, "Mama doll," in a voice full of wonder. In a voice. Alan's reaction to the muffler was more subdued, but no less genuine. He fingered the soft wool with obvious appreciation and then wrapped it around his neck with the air of a man receiving a treasure. "It's beautiful," he said. "Thank you." His gifts to them were equally thoughtful. For Mara, he'd carved a set of wooden spoons and spatulas, each one perfectly balanced and smooth as silk. For Becca, he'd created a miniature rocking chair that was an exact replica of the full-sized one by the fireplace. "For when you're telling stories to your doll," he explained, lifting his daughter into the chair to test the fit. Becca rocked back and forth with obvious delight, hugging her new doll and beaming at both adults. In that moment, Mara thought they looked like a real family, not a collection of damaged people seeking shelter from their respective storms, but a unit bound by genuine affection and shared purpose. The illusion was shattered 3 days later when a rider appeared at their door. Mara was in the kitchen preparing lunch when she heard hoofbeats in the yard. Through the window, she saw a man dismounting from a lathered horse, middle-aged, hard-faced, wearing the kind of clothes that suggested he was comfortable with violence. Alan, she called, her voice tight with alarm. He emerged from the barn, rifle in hand, moving with the careful alertness of a man who'd learned not to trust unexpected visitors. The stranger saw the weapon and raised his hand slightly, but his posture remained relaxed, almost insolent. "You Alan Reed?" the man asked. "Depends who's asking." "Name's Jack Chambers. I think you might have something that belongs to me." Mara's blood turned to ice. Chambers, the leader of the gang that had sworn vengeance for Bobby Hendrick's death. Somehow, impossibly, they'd tracked her here. Alan's grip tightened on his rifle. "Can't say I know what you're talking about." Chambers smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Pretty little thing you got staying with you. Dark hair, city manners, goes by the name of Jennings. Ring any bells?" "Might." Alan's voice was steady, but Mara could see the tension in his shoulders. "What's your interest in her?" "She cost me a good man. Best safecracker I ever worked with, and she got him killed with her clever tricks." Chambers stepped closer, his hand resting casually on his gun butt. "Now, I'm a reasonable man. I don't necessarily blame her for defending herself. But Bobby was family, and family deserves justice." "Justice?" Alan's laugh was harsh. "Your boy tried to rob a train full of innocents. He got what he deserved." "Maybe, but she's still got a debt to pay." Chambers' eyes moved to the house where Mara stood frozen in the doorway. "Hand her over, and there won't be any trouble. Keep her and, well, things might get unpleasant around here." For a moment, the two men faced each other across the yard, and the tension so thick it seemed to crackle in the cold air. Then Alan slowly raised his rifle, the barrel pointing directly at Chambers' chest. "Here's my counteroffer," he said quietly. "You turn around, get back on your horse, and ride out of here. Do that, and I won't put a bullet through your worthless hide." Chambers' smile widened. "You're outnumbered, Reed. I got 3 more boys waiting up on the ridge, all with rifles aimed at this pretty little homestead of yours. You want to start a war over some drifter woman you barely know. She's not a drifter. She's family." The words came out with quiet conviction that surprised even Mara. "And I don't negotiate with trash. Family." Chambers laughed. "That's sweet. Too bad it ain't gonna save her." He turned to go, then paused and looked back. "You got until tomorrow night to think it over, Reed. After that we come calling whether you're ready or not." After he'd ridden away, Alan stood motionless in the yard for several minutes, his rifle still ready, his eyes scanning the ridgeline for signs of the watchers Chambers had mentioned. Finally, he lowered the weapon and walked to the house. "Pack what you need," he told Mara tersely. "We're leaving. Tonight." "Alan, no." Mara stepped in front of him, her voice firm despite her fear. "This is your home. I won't let you abandon it because of me. It's just a place. You and Becca are what matter. And what happens next time? What happens when they track us down again?" She shook her head. "Running won't solve this." "Then what do you suggest?" Mara was quiet for a moment, thinking. When she spoke, her voice was steady with resolve. "We fight. Against 4 armed men, that's suicide. Maybe. Or maybe it's the only way to end this." She looked him in the eye. "I'm tired of running, Alan. I'm tired of being afraid. This is my fight as much as yours now." He studied her face, perhaps seeing something there he hadn't noticed before, a core of steel beneath the genteel exterior. "You know how to use that rifle. Well enough. And you're sure about this, because once we make this choice, there's no going back." Mara thought about the life she'd built here, the love she'd found with Becca, the quiet partnership she'd developed with Alan. It was worth fighting for, worth dying for if necessary. I'm sure. They spent the rest of the day preparing for war. Alan moved ammunition and weapons to strategic positions around the house, while Mara helped him barricade the lower windows and identify the best defensive positions. Becca, sensing the tension, but not understanding its source, stayed close to Mara. Her recent progress toward normal childhood temporarily reversed. As darkness fell, Alan made a difficult decision. "I need to take Becca to the Hendersons' place," he said. "It's too dangerous to have her here." The Henderson Ranch was 5 miles to the north home, to an elderly couple who'd been friends of Sarah's. They would take good care of Becca, but the round trip would take Alan away for several crucial hours. "What if they attack while you're gone?" Mara asked. "They won't. Chambers is too smart to try a night assault on unfamiliar ground. He'll wait for daylight when he can see what he's shooting at." The parting with Becca was heartbreaking. The child didn't understand why she was being sent away, and her distress was painful to witness. She clung to Mara with desperate strength, whispering, "No go," over and over. "I'll come back," Mara promised, kneeling to hold the child close. "No matter what happens, I'll find you. Do you understand?" Becca nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks, and Mara felt her own heart breaking. What if she was lying? What if the promise she'd just made was one she'd never be able to keep? After Alan and Becca left, Mara was alone with her thoughts for the first time in months. The house felt enormous and empty. Without their presence, every shadow potentially hiding an enemy, every sound a possible threat. She checked the rifle's loading for the dozenth time, then took up a position by the front window where she could watch the approach to the house. The night was clear and cold, with enough moonlight to see movement on the surrounding hills. Somewhere out there, Chambers and his men were waiting, planning their attack. Alan returned just after midnight, moving through the darkness with the careful stealth of a man who'd learned to hunt and be hunted. He slipped through the back door and found Mara still at her post rifle, ready eyes alert. "Any sign of them?" She shook her head. "It's been quiet, almost too quiet. They're there. I saw their campfire on the way back about 2 miles north. 4 men like Chambers said." "What's the plan?" Alan settled into position at the opposite window, his own rifle at the ready. "We wait. Make them come to us. The house gives us cover and limits their angles of attack. If we're lucky, we can hold them off until help arrives." "Help?" "I sent word to the sheriff in Willow Creek. He's got a deputy and maybe a few volunteers. If they got the message, they should be here by noon tomorrow." It was a slim hope, but better than none. They settled in to wait, taking turns, sleeping in the short shifts, while the other kept watch. Dawn came slowly, painting the eastern hills in shades of rose and gold, and with it came the sound they'd been dreading, hoofbeats approaching at a steady walk. Chambers and his men appeared at the edge of the clearing, staying just within rifle range, but far enough away to avoid easy shots. They sat their horses, calmly studying the house with professional interest. Reed, Chambers called. "Time's up, send the woman out and this ends peaceful-like." Alan positioned himself at the front window, rifle rested on the sill. "She stays where she is. Then you've chosen the hard way." Chambers wheeled his horse around and shouted something to his men. They scattered, taking up positions that would allow them to attack from multiple angles. The siege began with sporadic gunfire, with the outlaws testing the defenders' resolve and accuracy. Alan and Mara returned fire when they had clear shots, but mostly they conserved ammunition and waited. The thick log walls of the house absorbed the impact of bullets, and the barricaded windows provided good cover. As the morning wore on, the attacks became more coordinated. 2 men would provide covering fire while the other 2 attempted to advance. Alan and Mara worked together with increasing effectiveness, their movements coordinated by necessity and sharpened by shared danger. Around 10 o'clock, one of the outlaws made a serious mistake. Emboldened by the apparent lack of return fire, he broke cover and ran toward the house, probably intending to set it ablaze. Mara tracked him through her rifle sights, led him slightly, and squeezed the trigger. The man stumbled and fell, clutching his shoulder. He crawled back to cover, clearly out of the fight, and Chambers' voice roared with fury. "You shot Jimmy, you bitch, now it's personal." The next attack was vicious and sustained. All three remaining outlaws poured fire into the house, shattering what remained of the windows and splintering the wooden shutters. Alan and Mara crouched below the windowsills, unable to return fire, while bullets whined overhead and embedded themselves in the walls. During a brief lull, Alan grabbed Mara's arm. "They're going to rush us next," he said. "When they do, aim for center mass and keep shooting until they're down." She nodded, checking her ammunition. 5 bullets left, plus whatever was in Alan's rifle. Not enough for a prolonged fight. The final assault came with a wild yell from Chambers. All 3 men charged the house from different directions, firing as they ran. Alan took the one coming straight at the front door, his rifle booming twice in quick succession. The outlaw went down hard and didn't move. Mara swung toward the man approaching from the side, but her first shot went wide. He reached the wall of the house and began climbing toward her window. She could see his face clearly now, young, maybe 25, with wild eyes and bared teeth. He was almost close enough to grab her rifle when she finally found her mark. The impact spun him around and sent him tumbling backward off the low roof. He hit the ground hard and lay still. That left Chambers himself, and he'd chosen the most dangerous approach, straight through the front door that Alan had just abandoned to help Mara. She heard the wood splinter and crash, heard Alan curse as he tried to swing his rifle around in the confined space. The 2 men grappled in the doorway, too close for effective use of firearms. Chambers was younger and heavier, but Alan had the desperation of a man fighting for everything he held dear. They crashed into furniture, sending chairs flying and smashing crockery. Mara tried to get a clear shot, but the men were too close together, moving too fast. Then Chambers broke free and went for his pistol, and she knew she had only seconds to act. Her final bullet took Chambers in the chest, just as his gun cleared leather. He looked down at the spreading red stain on his shirt with an expression of profound surprise, then toppled backward and was still. In the sudden silence that followed, Mara and Alan stared at each other across the wreckage of their home. They were both alive, both unhurt, and their enemies were defeated. But the cost had been enormous, not just in property damage, but in the innocence they'd lost, the peace they'd sacrificed. "Is it over?" Mara asked quietly. Alan nodded, reloading his rifle out of habit. "It's over." They buried the dead that afternoon in a grove of aspens behind the house. It seemed wrong to leave them for the scavengers, regardless of what they'd done. The wounded man, Jimmy, would live to face justice in a proper court, assuming he survived the journey to the nearest jail. The sheriff arrived 3 hours too late, bringing a posse of 6 men who looked disappointed to have missed the excitement. He took statements, examined the bodies, and declared the whole affair a clear case of self-defense. Chambers' gang's been wanted in 3 territories, he told Alan as they watched the bodies being loaded into a wagon. "There's reward money coming to you, enough to repair your place, and then some." But money couldn't repair everything that had been broken. That evening, as they surveyed the damage to their home, both Mara and Alan were quiet with their own thoughts. "I should go," Mara said finally. "This happened because of me. If I leave, if you leave, the bastards win." Alan's voice was firm. "They wanted to drive you away from the first place you'd ever been happy. You going to let them succeed?" She looked around the bullet-riddled kitchen at the shattered windows and splintered furniture. "Look what staying cost you. Buildings can be repaired. Glass can be replaced." He moved closer, his voice gentle. "But if you go, Becca loses another mother. And I lose—" He paused as if the words were difficult to find. "I lose the best thing that's happened to this family since Sarah died." Tears sprang to Mara's eyes. "Alan, I know this isn't what you came west for," he continued. "I know I'm not the husband you dreamed of, and this isn't the life you planned. But if you'll have us, if you'll stay and help us rebuild, I promise you'll never have cause to regret it. It wasn't a declaration of love, exactly, but it was something perhaps more valuable. A promise of partnership, of shared purpose, of a life built on mutual respect and genuine caring. Yes, she said simply, I'll stay. They brought Becca home the next day, to a house that showed the scars of battle, but also the signs of healing. Alan had spent the morning clearing away the worst of the debris and boarding up the broken windows. It would take weeks to fully repair the damage, but the bones of their home were sound. Becca's reunion with Mara was everything the adults could have hoped for. The child flew into her arms with a joy that was almost painful to witness, babbling in a mixture of words and tears about how frightened she'd been, how much she'd missed Mama Mara. The words stopped both adults short. Becca had never called her that before, had never called anyone Mama since her birth mother's death. But now it came as naturally as breathing a recognition of the bond that had grown between them. Yes, little one, Mara whispered, holding the child close. Mama's here. Mama's not going anywhere. That night, after Becca had been put to bed in her own room for the first time in days, Alan and Mara sat before the fire in chairs that had somehow survived the battle unscathed. They were both exhausted emotionally and physically, but there was something to be said between them that couldn't wait. I need to ask you something. Alan said, his voice careful. And I want you to answer honestly, even if you think it might hurt my feelings. Mara nodded, suddenly nervous. Do you think you could ever love me? Not just tolerate me, not just appreciate what I can provide, but actually love me. He looked directly at her, his eyes vulnerable in a way she'd never seen. Because I know I'm falling in love with you. And if there's no chance of that being returned, I need to know now before we go any further. The question hung between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. Mara thought about the man who'd risked his life to save her from wolves, who'd fought beside her against impossible odds, who'd opened his home and heart to a stranger with nothing to offer but her willingness to work. She thought about the quiet partnership they'd built, the way he made her feel useful and valued and safe. I think, she said slowly, that I'm already in love with you. I just wasn't sure it was allowed. The smile that crossed Alan's face was like sunrise after the longest night. He reached for her hand, and she let him take it, their fingers intertwining with the same natural ease that had marked all their best moments together. So what happens now? She asked. Now we rebuild. The house, our lives, our future. He squeezed her hand gently. Together. Spring came early that year, melting the snow and bringing the first tentative flowers to the meadows around the ranch. The house had been fully repaired by then, with new windows that caught the morning light and walls that no longer bore the scars of gunfire. Alan and Mara were married on a warm April morning, with Becca as their only witness and the mountains of Nevada as their cathedral. It was a simple ceremony performed by a traveling preacher, but it felt as sacred as any elaborate church wedding could have been. Becca had approved of the union with the seriousness of a much older child, informing them gravely that she'd always known they belonged together. She'd also made it clear that she expected both parents to be permanent fixtures in her life from now on, a demand they were more than happy to meet. The years that followed were not without their challenges. Ranch life was never easy, and there were seasons of drought, harsh winters, and economic hardship that tested their resolve. But they faced each difficulty as a united family, drawing strength from their bonds and finding solutions through shared effort. Becca grew into a bright, articulate child who showed no lasting effects from her early trauma. She had her father's practical intelligence and her stepmother's gentle spirit combined with a natural resilience that served her well in their sometimes harsh environment. 3 years after the wedding, Mara gave birth to a son they named James, after Alan's father. 2 years later came daughter Sarah, named for the woman whose love had made their family possible in the first place. The house that had once seemed too large for its occupants now rang with the laughter and chatter of a growing family. Alan proved to be an attentive and loving husband, never taking Mara's presence for granted and always making sure she knew how much he valued her contributions to their life together. He supported her when she wanted to start a small school for the scattered children of their valley, and he listened with interest to her ideas about improving ranch operations. Mara, for her part, found in marriage and motherhood a fulfillment she'd never dared to imagine. She had a purpose that went beyond mere survival, a place where she was not just tolerated, but cherished. The frightened young woman who'd fled Kentucky in desperation had been transformed into a confident wife and mother who could face any challenge with courage and grace. The ranch prospered under their joint management, growing from a modest spread into one of the most successful operations in the territory. They added cattle, improved their breeding stock, and eventually branched out into horse raising. Alan's practical experience, combined with Mara's organizational skills and Becca's youthful energy, created a family business that was both profitable and sustainable. On quiet evenings when the children were in bed and the day's work was done, Alan and Mara would sit together on the porch he'd built to replace the one damaged in the battle with the Chambers gang. They would watch the sun set behind the western mountains and talk about their plans for the future, their hopes for their children, and the strange twists of fate that had brought them together. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if Silverbend had been honest?" Mara asked one such evening. "If he'd told me the truth about who he was and what he had to offer," Alan considered the question seriously, "I think you would have taken one look at his ramshackle place and caught the next train east. And I would have stayed a lonely widower, and Becca would have grown up without a mother's love. So we're grateful to a dead scoundrel. In a way, I suppose we are. Though I still think you would have ended up here eventually. Some things are just meant to be." Mara leaned against his shoulder, watching the first stars appear in the darkening sky. "I never thought I'd be grateful for that winter storm or for getting lost in the snow. But if none of that had happened, we never would have found each other," Alan finished. "Strange how the worst moments of our lives can lead to the best ones." As the territory grew and changed around them, and the Reed family remained a constant, a testament to the power of love to overcome adversity, and the possibility of finding home in the most unexpected places. Their story became part of the local folklore, told and retold by neighbors who remembered the mail-order bride who'd helped her husband fight off an outlaw gang and stayed to build a life that was richer than any she could have imagined. Becca grew up and married a young rancher from the next valley, establishing her own homestead within riding distance of her parents' place. James followed his father into ranching, showing an early aptitude for the work and a genuine love for the land. Young Sarah displayed her stepmother's gentleness and her father's strength, growing into a young woman who seemed destined for remarkable things. And through it all, Anne and Mara's love continued to deepen and mature, seasoned by shared trials and sweetened by shared joys. They had found in each other not just romantic love, but the kind of partnership that made all of life's challenges manageable and all of its pleasures more meaningful. The house they defended with rifle fire eventually became the heart of a thriving community. Other families settled nearby, drawn by the security and prosperity that the Reeds represented. A school was built, then a church, then a general store. What had once been empty wilderness became a place where children could grow up safely and dreams could take root and flourish. On their 25th wedding anniversary, surrounded by children and grandchildren, Alan and Mara looked back on the journey that had brought them together and forward to the years that still stretched ahead. They had built something lasting from the raw materials of love and determination, something that would endure long after they were gone. "No regrets?" Alan asked, echoing a question they'd asked each other many times over the years. "Only one," Mara replied with a smile. "I wish I could thank that girl who was brave enough to get off the train in Creswell, even though she was terrified." She had no idea what she was walking into, but she walked into it anyway. Alan raised his glass of wine in a toast. To brave girls and second chances. To finding home in the most unlikely places. Mara added. Around them, their family raised their own glasses, toasting a love story that had begun with deception and danger, but had grown into something beautiful and lasting. In the end, that was what the West was really about. Not the gunfights and gold rushes that captured the imagination, but the quieter victories of ordinary people who found ways to build extraordinary lives from whatever materials they had at hand. The wind still howled through the Nevada mountains on winter nights, and the desert still tested anyone foolish enough to challenge it unprepared. But in the warm, light-filled house that Alan and Mara had built together, there was proof that love could triumph over the hardest circumstances, that families could be forged from the most unlikely combinations of people, and that home was not a place you found, but something you created with your own hands and heart. Their story became part of the land itself, woven into the history of a place where dreams were as hardy as sagebrush and twice as stubborn. It was a testament to the truth that the best love stories are not about perfect people finding each other, but about broken people choosing to heal together, building something stronger from the pieces of their separate sorrows. And in the end, that was enough. More than enough. It was everything.